I knew the moment something was off. Zoe's smile was too sweet, like Splenda over a crime scene. She leaned against the marble counter near the espresso machine, tapping those glossy acrylics against her metal tumbler like she was timing something. I'd been grabbing my coffee from the executive wing for 12 years. Nobody cared. Nobody noticed. Until now. The second I poured my usual two-pump vanilla into the ceramic world's okayest compliance director mug. She looked at me like I'd just pissed in her chia pudding. You know that's a restricted zone, right? She said, low and syrupy, her tone dipped in condescension. I blinked halfway to the meeting room, thought she was joking. The restricted sign taped to the glass door was barely legible, curled at the edges, probably leftover from some long-forgotten COVID memo. I shrugged, raised the mug in salute. Didn't realize I needed a hazmat suit for my latte, I replied. That was at 9:04 a.m. At 2:13 p.m., HR called me in with the warmth of a morgue drawer. Three of them were seated like a firing squad. None made eye contact. The head of HR, Linda with the permanent frown, read from a paper like it was gospel. Due to willful breach of restricted consumption protocol, your employment is hereby terminated effective immediately. I stared, not blinked, not cried, just stared. My pulse was steady. My voice was calm. May I have a printout of my termination clause? I asked. Linda looked mildly annoyed, like I was asking for a refill during her vacation. But she handed it over. The words didn't sting, not really. What stung was the silence in the room. The knowledge that this had been planned, not just by Zoe, but by someone higher. I was 52, nearing my pension vest. My name was on more internal protocols than the CIO's. I was the compliance backbone that kept Luxure Tech's bloated carcass from being fined into oblivion. But none of that mattered now, not when there was a new darling of the executive floor, armed with a vape pen, a business degree from TikTok University, and a thirst for power. You know, it's funny. I spend most of my day reminding the company that little things, like chain of custody, record retention, multi-factor authorization, matter. Turns out the real compliance breach was having the audacity to age out of Zoe's LinkedIn filter. Before I stood to leave, I looked Linda dead in the eye and said, "You may want to review page 6 of the incident termination checklist. Section C, line 3. She blinked, confused. Why? I smiled. Just seems like today is a good day for accuracy. They escorted me out like I was radioactive. My coworkers, most of them good people, didn't know what to say. Some didn't even look. One tried to mouth sorry but looked away before he could finish. I walked out with my tote bag, my mug, and a mind buzzing with two truths. One, I wasn't mad. Yet two, I was going to give them exactly what they'd earned. It wasn't revenge, not in the Hollywood sense. There were no death threats or dramatic exits. Just one line of code. One authorization sequence, entered silently on my phone in the elevator on the way down. The same sequence I'd written 4 years ago as a contingency protocol. For compliance continuity, for security integrity, for when the wrong person got the right keys. They just gave her the keys. And hey, if you're still here listening to my little saga of caffeine-fueled sabotage, take a second to like the story and subscribe. It's free, it helps this channel keep the lights on, and frankly, 95% of y'all are freeloading worse than Zoe in her first week. Anyway, I didn't cry in the car. I didn't scream. I drove to my favorite bakery, bought a cherry turnover, and watched the Luxure Tech building fade in my rearview mirror like a bad habit I finally quit. My phone buzzed once, then twice. IT pinging the app I'd just touched. My face stayed calm. My pulse didn't even jump, because that wasn't the end of the story. That was just coffee. The real brew was still steeping. The security guy assigned to walk me out, Brent, poor kid, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Probably thought he was escorting a shoplifter from Target, not the woman who drafted the very protocols he was following. He didn't speak as we passed the break room, where someone had left a stale donut and half-drunk kombucha next to my Employee of the Month plaque from 2017. I looked at it for exactly 1 second, long enough to remember that back then, the CEO still knew my name. Back when we were a company that gave a damn about substance. Now we had ring lights in the executive wing and mindfulness circles hosted by interns. Just down this way, Brent mumbled, motioning toward the glass double doors like I didn't already know the exit route. I nodded, calm, blank-faced. But my hand moved without hesitation. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket like I was checking traffic. The app was buried 3 folders deep, Compliance Shell V 3.4.1. It looked like a calculator. Harmless. Boring, even. But it wasn't just some auditing tool. I'd built it over nights and weekends, layered in fail-safes and redundancies, encrypted its heartbeat to sync with our internal server matrix. I wasn't supposed to have admin override access anymore. It's supposed to only matters when someone's paying attention. I tapped in my sequence. 8 digits, no flourish, no fanfare, just confirmation, compliance bridge protocol, initiated. The moment I hit confirm, I felt a strange kind of peace, like stepping outside during a blackout and hearing silence for the first time. No alarms, no blinking lights. Just digital dominoes beginning to fall in places they didn't even remember existed. I slid my phone back into my pocket. You okay? Brent asked softly as we stepped into the elevator. I've had worse mornings, I said, which was true. I once sat through a 3-hour meeting with procurement arguing about whether PDF or DocX was a more ethical file format. On the main floor, I paused at the receptionist's desk. Sandra, bless her heart, looked up with wide eyes and tried to smile. I nodded once and handed her my ID badge. She hesitated. You sure? Policy, I said. Effective immediately. Her face fell, and that's when I realized she hadn't known. No one had. This was done quietly. Strategically. Maybe Zoe thought it would make her look decisive. Maybe the CEO thought removing me would simplify some internal power play. But what they didn't understand was that simplicity doesn't apply to systems built for legal survivability. You don't pull out the foundation and expect the house to stand just because it looks fine from the curb. I walked out with my coat zipped halfway, the wind catching just enough to sting my eyes. Across the street, someone from marketing stood in front of a food truck, scrolling on their phone. No one ran after me. No dramatic apologies. Just the sound of an empire carrying on like nothing had changed. Except it had. By the time I reached my car, first notification came in. A ping from my secondary email account, one they didn't know existed. It was a status update from Compliance Shell, bridge active. Internal triggers locked. Verification timer started. They wouldn't notice it today, maybe not even tomorrow, but the system had already begun retracting access to unverified documents, freezing cloud syncs, flagging audit trails, like a bloodstream silently clotting, unseen until the stroke hits. As I turned the key in the ignition, I thought about Zoe, her smug little nod when I left HR, the way she spun her tumbler like it was a trophy. She wouldn't understand what she'd done until she couldn't log into the quarterly reporting dashboard. By then, it'd be too late. Back at headquarters, someone in IT would start scratching their head. Then a few folks in finance would realize their compliance certification matrix wasn't auto-refreshing. Panic wouldn't hit right away. No, this was a slow burn, designed for plausible deniability, fully legal, entirely traceable, and reversible if you knew the override. Spoiler, they didn't. I parked in my driveway, turned off the engine, and just sat for a moment, staring at the silence. 12 years of service reduced to 1 cup of coffee and a piece of printer paper with my name misspelled. Humiliation is an art form in corporate America. But retaliation, that's a science, and I've got a PhD in both. By 8:17 a.m. the next morning, the first signs of the rupture surfaced like cracks in a windshield. IT flagged it as a non-critical sync interruption, which is corporate code for we have no clue what's going on, but please don't panic until lunchtime. Servers were sluggish, cloud backups timing out. The auto-generated compliance logs, which were supposed to compile daily reports for government clients, started returning blank fields. Metadata tables, empty. Access logs, garbled or redacted. By 9 a.m., the panic began to ripple. A level 2 escalation ticket hit the infrastructure Slack channel with one word in all caps, unverified. That was the keyword. That one word meant everything in the system, from vendor invoices to federal compliance certifications, was no longer traceable. In legal terms, the data had just been rendered inadmissible. The system had moved into what I'd built years ago as restricted access mode, a contingency buried so deep in protocol documentation that even most of the audit team didn't know it existed. Not unless they'd read footnote 42 on page 389 of the Internal Risk Response Manual. Spoiler alert, no one ever did. I sat cross-legged in my living room, oatmeal half-eaten, watching it all unfold through mirrored systems I wasn't supposed to have anymore. I could have pulled the plug right then, ended the freeze. But that would be like baking a pie and throwing it away before it cooled. What was the point of all those years of redundancy planning, if not to savor the failure of the fools who thought they could replace the person holding it all together? And still, a small part of me hoped. Maybe someone in leadership would remember the protocols. Maybe one of them would open the master continuity binder and see my red pen markings, the flowcharts that looked like spiderwebs, the initials CP, stamped on the bottom of every critical process. I didn't hide what I'd built. I just knew they never cared enough to learn it. At 9:31 a.m., my phone vibrated. Not from anyone important, just a news alert that Luxure Tech's e-invoicing portal had gone down. A vendor had tweeted at Luxure Tech, "Can't log in, getting error 3010 unverified." What's up? The tweet had one like. Mine. Across town, in the corner office with the hanging ferns and overpriced ergonomic chairs, Zoe was probably oblivious. Maybe filming a team-building TikTok about corporate resilience. Meanwhile, Linda from HR was likely in a state of denial, refreshing her dashboard and pretending it was just a Chrome cache issue. I could almost hear her passive-aggressive sighs. The best part, system didn't crash, it didn't explode or leak data. It simply paused, like a butler refusing to serve someone who never learned his name. By 10:07 a.m., the first big one dropped. Auto syncs with the Department of Energy's reporting portal failed. Completely. A 5-year, $40 million contract now at risk because some intern couldn't load an XML schema. The system required verified audit trails for everything touching federal data. Without me, or rather, without the credentials linked to my identity, it couldn't verify a damn thing. And like I designed it to, the system wasn't going to improvise. The official internal alert was concise. Status: system entering restricted access mode. Reason: unverified overrides detected. Last authorized sequence. See Preston, I'd signed that override protocol myself 2 years ago during a routine compliance exercise, buried it under 4 levels of authentication, and masked it as a maintenance function. Because I knew, someday someone would get bold. Someone would think the title compliance director was ornamental. Someone would sip oat milk lattes while undoing a decade of quiet labor and think they'd made the company leaner. They were about to learn what lean looked like when the lifeblood gets cut. I got up and poured myself another coffee. This time in a mug that read the system is the drama. A gift from my old assistant before she got promoted to an ops role in Atlanta. Smart girl. She texted that morning, did you do something? All hell's breaking loose here. I replied with a smile emoji, then deleted it. Better to say nothing for now. Satisfaction bloomed in my chest, but it wasn't joy. Not really. It was surgical, sterile. Like watching a plant you watered for years wilt under someone else's hand and thinking, well, what did you expect when you replaced the gardener with a house cat? They wanted to replace me over coffee. Now they couldn't even print an expense report. And this was just the morning. By 10:42 a.m., the executive floor at Luxure Tech looked like the opening scene of a low-budget disaster movie. People pacing with phones pressed to ears, monitors blinking with red warning icons, some poor intern from finance crying into her ergonomic keyboard. And in the middle of it all, Zoe, her flats clacking across the glass tiles, telling anyone who'd listen that everything was under control. It's just Carolyn being dramatic, she said, probably for the 5th time in as many minutes. She was always territorial. You should have seen how she'd freak out if anyone touched her spreadsheets. Spreadsheets, honey. I didn't build spreadsheets, I built scaffolding. Legal fortresses. Nested protocol chains that could outlast a cyber attack, a merger, and 4 rounds of layoffs. But sure, call them spreadsheets. The CEO, Gregory Lang, a man who'd once told me with a straight face that compliance was a necessary evil, sat at the head of the glass boardroom table with a vein in his forehead throbbing like a metronome. His phone was on speaker. On the line, Franklin Weiss, company's outside legal counsel. We need full access to the internal audit logs, Franklin barked. Send them to me in the next 10 minutes or I start drafting non-compliance exposure language for the board. Gregory waved frantically to the junior legal associate, Monica, who looked like she hadn't blinked since breakfast. Get it to him, he hissed. I can't, she stammered. Everything's locked. The folder structure's there, but the files are encrypted. I tried logging into the compliance portal, but the system says the access chain is broken. Franklin's voice came through the phone again, colder now. What does that mean? It means, Monica said, swallowing hard, Carolyn's account was the verification anchor. Her credentials were the gatekeeper for cascading access. And since she's been, terminated, Franklin groaned. So you terminated the one person whose identity validated half your federal-facing infrastructure. Gregory rubbed his temples. She drank coffee in a restricted area, Frank. It was a violation. Silence. Then Franklin said, good luck explaining that to the SEC if this goes public. In the background, Zoe tried to do damage control. We just need IT to bypass the security. It's probably a matter of resetting the server permissions or whatever. The problem? The CTO, Gavin, was on a silent meditation retreat in Arizona with 0 cell service. He was off-grid by design, his vacation response smugly reminding everyone that true leadership is the ability to step away. The CIO, Meredith, was physically present but might as well have been made of plywood. Meredith's entire relationship with compliance could be summarized by her signature phrase, "Isn't that Carolyn's department?" Now it wasn't. She tried to make sense of the chaos on her own, sifting through auto-generated access logs like a person reading a foreign language in reverse. At one point, she called over a guy from InfoSec and whispered, "Can't we just restore from backup?" He checked the system, squinted, then said, "Backups paused at 3:34 p.m. yesterday. Same minute Carolyn was terminated. System marked all stored data as condition pending review. It's running, but it won't commit to a write cycle until the compliance anchor is authenticated again." Translation: I'd built the system to doubt itself without me. Gregory slammed his palm on the table. So reboot it. The InfoSec guy just stared. Sir, we can't reboot what doesn't trust itself. That's when things started unraveling faster. A client from the Department of Transportation sent a formal inquiry asking why their access credentials weren't working. The marketing team couldn't pull analytics because the system flagged the metrics as unverified extrapolations. Payroll systems pinged HR asking why the employee verification matrix was empty. In every case, the same alert appeared. Compliance anchor undefined. They started pointing fingers like they were in a game of corporate clue. It was Monica in the boardroom with the failure to escalate. No, it was Gavin for going off the grid. It was Carolyn. She sabotaged the system. Even Zoe, suddenly sweating through her pastel blouse, began distancing herself. I mean, Carolyn was really weird about her systems. I always said someone should review her protocols. Protocols she never read. Documents she couldn't even pronounce, let alone explain. From my kitchen table, I watched it unfold through mirrored logs, nothing invasive. Just breadcrumb alerts feeding back through a private status channel I'd set up years ago for emergency redundancy audits. I sipped my tea and watched the chaos bloom like mold in a damp basement. It wasn't just disruption. It was exposure. All those years I'd operated like wallpaper, invisible, expected, quietly keeping the company upright, were suddenly blaring through every error code. My absence wasn't just noticeable. It was radioactive. And the worst part for them? The real system failover hadn't even triggered yet. That came next. By 3:05 p.m., Gregory Lang was in full spin mode. The kind of delusional optimism that only CEOs and bad magicians can muster when their audience starts noticing the wires. The board meeting was already 20 minutes in when he clicked to a slide titled Temporary System Irregularities. The phrase "we're migrating cloud environments" 3 times in the first minute, and tried to plaster a smile across his already slick face. "This is just a hiccup," he insisted, gesturing vaguely at a bar graph that showed a 70% drop in back-end task completion. "We've been meaning to update our audit infrastructure for months." Frankly, this was overdue. The board stared at him like he'd just claimed the Titanic was taking on refreshing amounts of water. "Are we sure?" came a voice from the far end of the table. "This isn't related to Miss Preston's departure?" The question came from Patricia Hellman, former federal compliance officer, current board director, widow of a judge. Her hair was perfect, her nails sharper than truth, and when she spoke, people didn't interrupt, not even Gregory. He blinked. "With respect, Patricia, Carolyn's role was important, yes, but the current issues," she raised a hand. "Stop." Silence fell like a gavel. "I've read the alerts. I've reviewed the escalation logs. This isn't a glitch. A glitch is a line of code failing. What we have here is an entire compliance anchor protocol revoking system-wide authentication across every chain of data custody." Patricia turned to the head of legal. "Did you know we were using a single identity failover system for federal audit validation?" Monica looked like she'd just swallowed a stapler. I wasn't aware of the depth of integration." Patricia arched a brow. "Then what exactly were you aware of?" Gregory jumped in, desperate now. "We've already begun contacting vendors to restore access, and I've tasked our interim audit lead with compiling a reverse authentication framework." "There's no interim audit lead," Patricia said flatly. "You eliminated the compliance department when you terminated its only director without a transition plan." Could practically hear the oxygen leave the room. Even Zoe, sitting 2 seats over from the CEO with her phone face down for once, didn't dare speak. "And one more thing," Patricia added. "Why was she fired? For coffee?" Gregory coughed. "It was technically a breach of the restricted consumption policy. I helped write that policy," Patricia said. "It was meant for the server floor, not a Keurig in an executive hallway." Then she leaned back, folded her hands like a judge about to pass sentence. "And even if it had been a violation, firing someone with clearance across every compliance layer should have involved transitional debrief, access cascade shutdown, and system redundancy checks. You did none of that." Gregory opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Across the city, I sat in a quiet downtown office with a view of the courthouse. The person across from me was reviewing a document with a red pen, methodical, line by line, scribbling small notes in the margins. Clause 7C confirms it," she said finally, without looking up. "You were terminated without cause under a fabricated policy breach less than 60 days before pension vesting. That's not just wrongful termination, it's retaliatory." I nodded. "I thought so." She set the pen down and looked me in the eye. "You said this isn't about getting your job back. It's not. Then what is it about?" I glanced at my phone. Another alert. Luxure Tech's East Coast vendor just paused its contract, citing inability to verify delivery credentials. I looked back at her and smiled. "It's about reminding them what happens when you build your castle on a foundation you never bothered to understand." She tilted her head, studying me. "You could bury them. I mean really bury them." "I know," I said, "but that's not the plan." She raised an eyebrow. "I want them to crawl back," I continued in front of the board. In front of Zoe, in front of every person who watched me get marched out like a thief for sipping a damn latte. "And I want them to ask." "And then?" she asked. I took a sip of my tea, then I decide. We shook hands. No paperwork yet, no lawsuit filed. Just potential, icy, and patient, because power isn't always taken. Sometimes it's withheld. Let Gregory blame the server migration. Let Zoe pretend nothing's wrong. Let Monica scramble through hundreds of password-locked documents with file names like Policy A1 FINA L Final. Let Patricia keep pulling thread after thread. I wasn't torching anything. I was just pulling out the pins one by one. At exactly 10:22 the next morning, the email hit procurement like a meteor. Subject line: Contract hold urgent response requested. The sender: Office of Federal Transport Systems. Translation: the government. The email was short, brutal, and very clear. Due to incomplete and unverifiable risk compliance certification, we are formally placing contract hash LX 44803 on hold pending internal review. Please note, this is a precautionary measure in accordance with federal procurement standards and does not imply wrongdoing. However, require clarification of audit trail continuity within 5 business days or the contract will be considered void. The amount, $40 million, already budgeted. Already announced in a breathless press release 3 weeks earlier with Gregory posing in front of a giant digital rendering of a smart logistics grid he couldn't spell, let alone implement. The panic began before the email was even fully read. Procurement called legal. Legal called compliance. Compliance didn't exist. Monica, shaking so hard her mouse kept skipping off the screen, tried to pull the master audit logs for the system pathways involved. But every attempt resulted in the same automated message, unable to verify custodial integrity of chain. Compliance anchor, unknown, they were locked out of their own evidence. The logs, the core legal proof of delivery, compliance, and ethical standards, were all nested behind Carolyn Preston's identity. Not just her login, her signature chain encrypted into every protocol to satisfy federal risk mitigation standards. Because that's what federal contracts require, a traceable human authority. They had fired the human. The system had responded accordingly. Gregory screamed at it. IT blamed legal. Legal blamed Zoe. Zoe tried to blame Carolyn, but by then, no one was listening to her. Meanwhile, in my home office, I sat in sweatpants, watching 3 separate procurement-related email chains unravel. I had my feet propped on the edge of the coffee table, a steaming mug of chamomile in hand, and a growing sense that maybe this wasn't just vindication anymore. It was something deeper, hotter, angrier, because the truth was this didn't need to happen. They could have handled my violation with a warning, an apology, even just basic professionalism. But instead they paraded me out like a cautionary tale. They wanted humiliation, they wanted silence. They were about to get neither. My phone buzzed, unknown number, 202 area code, DC. I answered on the 3rd ring. This is Carolyn. A crisp voice, female, very composed. Miss Preston, this is Sandra Williams, Executive Assistant to Board Chair Alan Grayson. He's requesting a private meeting with you. Today, your convenience. His schedule is open. My lips parted. I hadn't heard that name in a long time. Alan Grayson, the invisible hand behind every major luxury-tech expansion, rarely seen, rarely heard, but known for killing bad acquisitions with a single phone call. He'd like to meet off-site, Sandra continued. No security, no intermediaries. He said you'd prefer discretion. I paused, letting the weight of that settle. Where? There's a private office he uses for sensitive matters. I'll text you the address. Is noon acceptable? I'll be there. I hung up and exhaled. The burn in my chest wasn't satisfaction anymore. It was fury, finally let loose from its polite leash. Because this wasn't just about Zoe and her petty power plays. This was about a system that treated its most loyal people like ink cartridges, useful until the warranty expired. And now, that system was hemorrhaging cash and blood and couldn't stop itself. I arrived early. The building was unmarked, sleek, somewhere in Midtown. An assistant led me up through a private elevator. The door opened into a long conference room where Alan Grayson stood alone, no suit jacket, sleeves rolled, holding a legal pad already half filled with notes. He didn't shake my hand, didn't offer coffee, just motioned to a chair. You know what's happening? He asked. I sat. I know what I triggered. I don't know what they've told you. He nodded, barely a blink of emotion. They told me we're fine. The contract is a technical hold, that this will resolve itself in 48 hours. I tilted my head. Then why am I here? He tapped the pad with his pen. Because I read the actual contract. And the fine print says any lapse in certifiable risk compliance triggers a federal re-review. That can take 6 months or a year or kill the deal entirely. I folded my hands. They shouldn't have fired me. He looked up. They shouldn't have. But they did, and now we're in a tailspin. What I want to know is this: how far are you willing to let this go? I met his eyes, unflinching. I haven't even decided if I'm done yet. He leaned back slowly. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his expression that looked a lot like respect, or fear, or both. The room went quiet. The power had shifted. Not with a bang, but with a withheld signature. And I was just getting started. The doors to the boardroom creaked open like they were ashamed to be part of this performance. I stepped inside dressed not for war, but for clarity. Navy slacks, white blouse, pearl earrings I hadn't worn since my mother's funeral. I walked like the decision had already been made, because it had, just not by them. Gregory was already mid-rant, red in the face, pacing like a substitute teacher trying to reclaim order after a fire drill. Completely unprofessional. Carolyn, vindictive, and frankly, embarrassing for everyone involved. His finger jabbed toward the board, then back at me. This is a company, not your personal chessboard. Zoe sat beside him, suddenly quieter than she'd been in her entire adult life, her lips pursed, phone face down for once. The rest of the board stared like they weren't sure if they were watching a deposition or the trailer for a thriller. Alan Grayson stood at the head of the table, arms folded, unmoving. Just observing, not intervening, not saving anyone, which made everyone even more nervous. Let's be honest, Gregory spat, you came here to feel powerful. That's what this is. You were given decades of employment, and when it ended cleanly by the book, you decided to burn the place down out of spite. I didn't respond. I didn't roll my eyes or let out a theatrical sigh. I just sat in the chair reserved for guests and placed my phone gently on the table like it was a prayer book. This meeting is a courtesy, Gregory went on. You're here because Alan asked for it, but there's no reinstatement coming. We're working on new frameworks. The vendors are coming back online. Your tantrum has been noted. He smiled smugly like he'd just landed the closing argument in a courtroom drama. You're not needed anymore. Still, I said nothing. Instead, I tapped once on the screen of my phone. The vibration was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but it was a signal, a trigger I had written into the redundancy protocol 5 years ago. Not destructive, not permanent, just revealing. The large monitor behind Gregory flickered once, then again. Zoe noticed first. The screen switched from a bland pie chart of recovery metrics to a new window altogether. The system logs, one by one. A list of internal systems populated across the boardroom's 72-inch smart display. Financial filings, tax documentation, vendor certifications, all of them labeled with 3 bold red letters, unverified. Wait, Gregory said, turning around. What is this? More items appeared. Export licenses, quarterly earnings, audit trails. Then the payroll verification matrix, flagged for missing identity linkage. Then an alert that read, chain of custody interrupted. Anchor, C. Preston status, disavowed. The legal counsel's jaw clenched. Patricia Hellman blinked slowly, leaned forward, and simply said, Jesus Christ. Gregory turned back to me. You can't just hack the system in the middle of a board meeting. I tilted my head, still silent, then gently slid a printed document across the table toward Patricia. She opened it, her brows lifted. It's not a hack, she said aloud. It's a system update, triggered by an anchor failure. Fully documented protocol. Gregory stammered. But we reset her access. No, Patricia corrected. You terminated the access without initiating chain transfer protocol. The system isn't malfunctioning, it's doing exactly what it was designed to do. Which, ironically, Carolyn designed. Alan finally spoke. How long will it stay like this? I looked him square in the eye. Until I reverse the cascade. Or until you rebuild the entire infrastructure from scratch. Ballpark, 9 months. Maybe a year if your CTO ever returns from his goat yoga retreat. Zoe made a soft choking noise. Gregory's voice cracked like brittle plastic. You're doing this out of revenge. That was when I finally spoke. No, I'm doing this because your ignorance was weaponized. You fired me for coffee. You paraded me out like I was a criminal. You wanted to make an example of me. I leaned forward slightly. Well, here's your example. A fresh alert dinged across the monitor. Dot review escalated. Contract in jeopardy. I didn't look at the screen. I looked at Zoe. She couldn't hold my gaze. Gregory turned to Alan, desperate. We can't give in to this. She's blackmailing us. No, Alan said coolly. She's demonstrating the value you flushed down the drain because someone wanted to prove a point. Then he turned to me. Carolyn, what do you want? My fingers drummed the table once, then stopped. I took a breath, and I told them. The silence after I spoke felt like a vacuum had sucked all the oxygen out of the boardroom. You could hear someone's bracelet clink softly as they shifted in their chair. Gregory's mouth was open, mid-rebuttal, but no sound came out. His face, once flushed with righteous fury, had gone waxy and pale. He was still staring at the screen behind him, as if he could will the red unverified warnings into vanishing by sheer denial. Then something else happened. The display flickered once again, this time opening a secondary window. A command line interface, simple, black background, white courier text, appeared in the top left corner. Lines of code began streaming down. System verification failover initiated. Node tree integrity suspended. Failsafe protocol CRP72 engaged. The legal counsel, who'd been half watching until now, stood abruptly, stepping toward the screen like a man watching his own trial unfold. He squinted. His lips moved silently as he read the sequence. Then he saw it. The header at the top of the terminal feed, protocol owner, C. Preston override chain authenticated. He turned slowly, eyes wide. Sir, stop. Gregory blinked like he was coming out of anesthesia. What? The lawyer didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He's the only one who can reverse this. Gregory took a step back. That's not possible. She doesn't even work here. She wrote the infrastructure, Patricia said, her voice calm and clinical. We let her walk out with the keystone in her pocket. That's when I smiled. Just once. No gloating, no villain monologue, just a small curl of the lips that said, you did this to yourselves. Alan Grayson leaned forward, not rushed, not rattled, just decisive. Carolyn, he said evenly, name your terms. Gregory spun toward him. You can't be serious. Alan didn't look at him. I'm not losing this company because you let a 24-year-old TikTok intern pick our compliance targets based on hallway coffee rules. I don't negotiate with hostages, Gregory snapped. Good, I replied, folding my hands, because this isn't a negotiation. Zoe was trying to become invisible in her chair now, her posture shrinking by the second. I cleared my throat and spoke clearly, slowly, for the record. First, Zoe's contract is terminated immediately, with cause, her access revoked by end of day. Zoe flinched. Second, HR leadership, specifically Linda, is placed under third-party audit for protocol abuse. I want full disclosure of every termination handled over the last 5 years. Everyone. Linda, sitting toward the back of the room, went rigid. She opened her mouth to object, and thought better of it. Third, I continued, my role is reinstated but elevated. Title, Chief Ethics Officer. I report directly to the board, not the CEO, not HR. Gregory made a noise like a dying air conditioner. And lastly, I said, my voice cool, Gregory is placed on administrative leave pending full review of retaliatory behavior, including abuse of termination policy, executive overreach, and obstruction of internal protocols. His badge is disabled the minute I confirm the system override. Gregory lunged forward. This is a corporate coup. No, Patricia said almost gently. This is what it looks like when someone with actual integrity decides to clean house. Alan looked around the room, saw no objections, then turned to me. If we give you that, you'll reverse the failover? I'll stabilize it, I said. You'll have partial functionality restored within the hour. Full restoration by morning. But the override key doesn't return to the system until every item I just listed is fulfilled. And I want it in writing. The lawyer didn't even wait. He'd already pulled out a legal pad. Gregory staggered backward, slumping into a chair like the room had finally spun too fast for him to keep up. You played us, he muttered. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. You played yourself. I just let the system hold the mirror. The room was silent again, but this time, no one could hide behind ignorance. They weren't watching a power grab, they were witnessing a reclamation. The walls that had always held up luxury tech weren't collapsing, they were just shedding the rot. Behind me, the boardroom screen updated one final time. Override key pending, terms accepted. Draft in progress, awaiting confirmation from C. Preston. I picked up my phone, but I didn't press confirm. Not yet. I stood up slowly. Not for drama. Not to intimidate, just because it was time. 12 years of whispered warnings, unread memos, and buried documentation had led to this one moment where silence finally spoke louder than the shouting. Here are my terms. Final, I said, leveling my voice like a gavel. First, Zoe is gone, not reassigned, not relocated. Gone. She violated ethical oversight by weaponizing a protocol meant for emergency containment and used it to stage a public execution over a coffee cup. Her badge should already be deactivated. No one argued, not even Zoe, who sat there ashen, her spine curling into her seat like she was trying to vanish into the upholstery. Second, HR is audited. Fully. Every file, every firing, every clause they've ever twisted into a pretzel to justify retaliation or cover managerial tantrums. I want a third-party firm, not someone from your golf club. Linda's mouth opened, then closed. Her fingers tightened around her stylus until it snapped in two. Third, I continued, but not to clean up your mess. I return with authority. New title, Chief Ethics Officer. Direct report line to the board, bypassing HR, bypassing operations. I'm not here to babysit egos anymore, I'm here to safeguard the people doing the work. Gregory tried to scoff, but the sound came out hollow. I turned to him, and finally you. His eyes locked on mine, glassy and bloodshot. I stepped closer, calm, merciless. You're suspended effective immediately. Pending a full investigation into retaliatory termination, unethical conduct, and systemic neglect of federal compliance responsibilities. You'll have your day with the board. For now, you don't speak. You don't decide, you step aside. He opened his mouth, but no words came, just a wheeze, a man drowning in his own delusion. I turned back toward the board, draft the terms. I'll sign them once I see them on paper. Alan gave a single nod to the lawyer who was already scribbling furiously, then turned to me. And the system? I lifted my phone. The screen was still on that same terminal prompt, awaiting final key. I pressed my thumb to the screen. Override authorized. System re-verified. The boardroom screen changed, red turning to green like a cardiac monitor finding a pulse. One by one, the logs updated, compliance restored. Chain verified, access synced. Contract status active, DOT portal live. Outside the glass walls, through the etched Luxure Tech logo, I could see employees looking up from their desks as monitors flicked back to life. Slack notifications reappeared. Server activity resumed. You could almost feel the building take a breath. Then came the applause. It wasn't coordinated. It wasn't polite. It was raw, genuine, an eruption of something that had been held down too long. Dozens of staff on the floor beyond the glass stood up, clapping, some whistling, some just smiling wide. They didn't know every detail. They didn't have to. All they knew was that someone had stood up to the rot and won. Didn't wave. I didn't bow. I just turned, lifted my tote bag over my shoulder, and picked up the one thing they'd tried to shame me for, my coffee. I walked out past Gregory, who couldn't even meet my eyes anymore. Past Zoe, whose screen had gone dark. Past Linda, whose hands trembled over her cracked stylus. Past the boardroom where too many voices once spoke over mine. And no one, not one soul, dared stop me this time. The mug was warm in my... The system was whole again. And I, finally, wasn't, I was more. Big thanks for watching, you sneaky seniors. Subscribe to keep the coffee pot brewing revenge. Your ex-colleagues won't know what hit 'em.